Professor Gattinger, thank you very much for joining us today. And today we're going to be talking about energy narratives in Canada. So we've seen a big shift in the way Canadians talk about energy. Some of it is still rooted in the old fossil fuel, oil, gas, and coal economy and the narratives of old. But there's new narratives emerging on the clean energy side, and especially as we head into electrification of the economy. How have you seen that public narratives, the discussion, the conversation around energy evolve over the last 3, 4, 5 years?
Wow, to answer that in a short period of time is a tough one. So I think, I'd really just start with a couple of main points. One would be we don't see consensus in Canada around what is the country's energy future in an age of climate change. There are really two big visions that people have put forward over the last number of years, one of which starts from the Paris targets and climate science, and really is very aggressive about moving on climate change and reducing emissions. And then the second is much more starting from economics and from global energy demand and looking at Canada's fossil fuel sector and the opportunities to sell oil and gas into international markets. And there isn't a lot of space necessarily in between those two narratives. And I think what we've seen over the last number of years is kind of the ebbing and flowing or rising and lowering of temperatures around each of those narratives.
That's very interesting, and I'm fascinated by the work that's being done by Abacus Data and their polling around oil and gas and pipelines and climate change, because what's come out of their data over the last, say, 5 years is the sense that Canadians, they may not have thought through the issue, but they've come to kind of a consensus where they say, look, we like clean energy. We want to head off to that low carbon future. We like that. But at the same time, we know that this transition is going to take decades. In the meantime, as long as governments are putting in place policies that support clean energy, we're okay with continued development of oil and gas and pipelines. It's very much a middle, pragmatic, centrist kind of Canadian approach to these things. And while 50 or 60, whatever the number is, but a solid majority think like that, that view is not reflected in the national discussion very often. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think that's an excellent point. We often draw the distinction in our work between, what you can think of as kind of elite or kind of inside baseball, the folks who are really engaged on these issues, whether because they're in industry or ENGOs or government and the like, and then your average, quote unquote, average Canadians. And we've done public opinion polling work that suggests exactly the same issue, that most Canadians are very pragmatic in their views on these issues. They want to see oil and gas development, even increased development in the country, but at the same time, they want to see it done in an environmentally responsible fashion. I think, though, what has tended to, galvanize attention, whether it's attention of the media or of political leaders, is sort of either end of the tails of public opinion. And many of the folks who are engaged in this for their day jobs, whether in ENGOs or in industry, can sometimes be found on either end of those tails. And that tends to be what we see being reported, even though it doesn't necessarily capture what the average Canadian, what their views might be.
So it sounds to me, if I understand our little discussion so far, the narrative around Canada, Canadians are in the middle. They're pragmatic. They're centrist. Now we've got two extremes on the continuum fighting it out for dominance in the media and in the public discussion. That leads to polarization. And I know you're concerned about the polarized debate around energy in Canada. What is it that concerns you about that polarization?
Oh boy, where to begin? I think one of the things that concerns me the most about the polarization is that it really challenges ongoing positive progress, whether that's on climate change mitigation or whether that's on responsible development of Canada's energy resources. Because polarization tends to lead to a situation, as we're seeing, where it becomes sort of all or nothing thinking. It's either it's my way or it's the highway. And when we see that being, filtering into our political decision making and into our elections, what we then begin to see is wild swings in public policy. And we've seen this over the last number of years. So, one day there's a carbon price, the next day maybe there isn't at the provincial level. One day there's an emissions cap at the provincial level in Alberta, the next day there isn't an emissions cap. And frankly, that's very challenging, not only for industry, who looks to secure predictable policy and regulatory climate, but it's also very challenging for progress on climate change as well, because you've got policies vacillating, one step forward, two steps back. And then Canadians, of course, look at this and they say, well, geez, what's going on?
I want to get your take on something that I put in my book, The New Alberta Advantage, and it's basically the first two chapters of the book. And a lot of the discussion around the energy transition, you see this when you look at anything written by the International Energy Agency, the IEA. It's all about, anytime there's energy transition, in the same sentence there's going to be climate change. That's what drives it from their point of view. But I have a different take on it, because the experts that I've interviewed over the last 4 or 5 years are saying that really, well, it may have been policy that primed the pump 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. The pump is now primed, and the pump is going on its own. The technology is driving the process, driving the transition. Capital investment is driving it. Consumers now you're starting to see it with electric vehicles, are beginning to drive this transition, and policy less so. And I wonder if maybe we haven't missed an opportunity to, in our narratives, to talk about that, instead of centering the energy transition conversation around the climate crisis, which people get a little fatigued about that. But if you talk about how no, this is, these are driven by processes like technology, that yes, there's risks to be mitigated, but there's also opportunities to be seized. New companies, new technologies, new jobs, new skills, new training. What's your take on that?
I think it's a really interesting point. My own view is that it's going to take all of the above. If you think about the energy systems that we have, they are systems that are built on long-lived capital infrastructure projects that are, baked in to our everyday lives through infrastructure, individual choices, and the like. And changing those systems, it's almost, you can think about sort of shifting course of a large, cruise ship. It takes time, and it's going to take a variety of different measures to make that move. So even, again, to your point about the IEA, if you look at the percentage of global energy demand that's accounted for by fossil fuels, you're talking about roughly 80%. Well, that figure has been 80% since about 1970. So despite all of our decades of trying to change things, whether from a policy perspective or a technology perspective, we haven't actually made a big change in that overall system. There are a whole bunch of reasons for that, but I think it comes back to my response to your question, which is that it's really going to take all of the above: individual behavior, company investment decisions, investor investment decisions, but also government policy as well.
Now, you pay a lot of attention to energy narratives in Canada. What sort of stories do Canadians tell themselves, or what kind of stories do Canadian media tell about energy these days?
Well, I think the stories are, ironically, in some ways, the fact that we've had such controversy over energy over the last number of decades, or the last number of years, I should say, notably the last decade, that's been really challenging for the country. At the same time, one of the positive things I would say about that is that it's actually enabled Canadians to learn a little bit more about energy. We in Canada don't tend to think a whole lot about where energy comes from, where it's sourced. I think that's the benefit of having had a very secure, affordable, reliable, plentiful energy system. And so many of the stories that we tell ourselves are aspirational, right? So yes, we want to reduce the climate impacts of energy, but at the same time, do we know about how to undertake to do that? It's sometimes much more complicated than than folks give it credit for. And unfortunately, in the media, with the tendencies toward sound bites and shorter stories, and not having a lot of reporters like yourself, frankly, Markham, who can sit down and really look at these issues in a really in-depth way, Canadians don't necessarily get the full story that perhaps would be helpful for them in informing their own choices and their own opinions.
Let me give you a different take then on the issue of polarization. Does conflict around that comes out of the polarization, conflict between these different worldviews, these different narratives, is the fact that it gets media attention and gets people's attention, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we need polarization will ultimately lead to some kind of synthesis that we all agree on after, maybe 5 years down the road after we duke it out between the various camps. What do you think?
I don't know that I have an academic answer for you on that, so I'll give you a sort of a hunch answer for you on that. Some of the polarization we're seeing right now, it makes me think of the free trade debate that we had in the 80s over free trade with the United States. It became a very substantial election issue. We had the quote unquote free trade election. And as we know now, free trade has become something in the Canadian consciousness that is agreed across party lines. So to your point, there is potentially some real benefit to polarization and to having these very important issues find their way into election campaigns, because it does give Canadians an opportunity to really learn about the issues and to develop their own opinions on them. Where I have some concerns, though, is that we're beginning to see, along with this polarization, what I think of as partisan polarization. So some of these issues are becoming polarized along partisan lines. So whether or not one thinks that a carbon tax is a good idea relates to which party one belongs to. Whether or not one thinks that pipelines are a good idea depends which party one belongs to. And that, I think, is quite troubling from a decision-making perspective, because then you wonder, well, how much real evidence is going to be used to inform decisions, as opposed to sort of partisan ideology that sits on one end or the other of the spectrum. So I think that the jury is out on that one, but certainly the ability for Canadians to get more engaged on these issues represents a real opportunity.
I want to talk about energy narratives in different provinces, because I live in BC, but we do a lot of reporting in Alberta. There are two provinces that have, I think it's fair to say, different ideas about the role of energy, the role of fossil fuels, and the energy transition. Ontario has a different point of view. Quebec, because of its hydro resources, has a different point of view. What are some of the narratives that come out of the regions as opposed to the national narratives?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, I've often wondered, in the Canadian context, so, not only are we a democracy with plentiful energy resources, but we're also a federation within which the provinces hold, most of the jurisdiction over energy development. And we're also a country within which energy resources are distributed in regionally different ways across the country. So you mentioned it yourself, Quebec with hydro, BC would be similar, Manitoba would be similar, and Ontario we've got nuclear, Alberta obviously oil and gas, same thing in Saskatchewan. And so I think what that has done is that energy means different things in different parts of the country. And so the narrative in different parts of the country is a different narrative, because people have a different understanding of what energy is and a different connection to what energy is. In the East, people tend to be a little bit more energy consumers than they are energy producers, in terms of certainly on the oil and gas front. And then when it comes to the stories that folks tell themselves in, let's say, a jurisdiction like Quebec, where they have had a very strong provincial connection to the creation of Quebec Hydro and to all of that energy that's zero emitting electricity, there's a real strong commitment to deploying that as much as they're able to deploy it. So I think it's created very different regional cultures and ideas of energy and stories about energy across the country.
One of the principles that we base our energy journalism on is the idea that Canada should work to mitigate the risks that come from the energy transition, but also to seize and exploit those opportunities that are presented by. So it could be the rise of clean tech. It could be, different technologies that arise out of the the transition to electricity, the electrification of transportation, whatever it might be. And do you think that if we don't have change those narratives, don't change the way we think about it and talk about energy, that we might miss opportunities that will prevent Canada from being well positioned to be prosperous later in this, in this century when we really are all electrified?
Well, first of all, I don't know if we're really all going to be electrified, but maybe that's another question we can get to later on. But most credible energy scenarios that you look at do continue to see a place for fossil fuels in the future, notably oil and gas. That said, I do agree with you that are we missing out on opportunities? Potentially. And I think it's opportunities not only on the quote unquote clean energy front, but also opportunities to produce into the world marketplace that will continue to need oil and gas, that will continue to be consuming hydrocarbons. And then what role does Canada want to play in that future? And I don't think that we've necessarily had the sort of evidence-based, really rigorous, informed debates on these issues that we could have.
Tell me how your organization, Positive Energy, plans to participate in those energy debates in the future, and ways that you'll help Canadians better participate in those debates.
Well, I would like to think that we'll be able to be helpful. So we tend to be less about, here's what Canada should do when it comes to energy transition or when it comes to the development of its oil and gas resources, and much more about looking at kind of the governance and politics that inform decision making. So, for example, what we're focusing in on right now in our research is polarization, getting a better understanding of how bad is it, on what issues are we polarized, and how can we, more importantly, how can we work to try to navigate through or overcome polarized context? Because our sense is that that's really costing the country. It's costing the country in a whole host of ways, as we talked about a moment ago. I think the other thing that we're focusing in on that could be quite useful is doing a better job of thinking about how do we strengthen public confidence in the decision-making bodies that we have that are making these important decisions for our future. And we tend to focus in on public authority, so that's government, it's regulatory agencies. We haven't talked at all in this interview yet about Indigenous governments, but what are some of the ways in which we can strengthen public confidence in the decision-making roles of each of those institutions collectively, respectively, how they can do a better job of working together. And then the third area we're focusing in on is consensus building. How can we, and it relates, of course, to polarization, but what are some of the key models to try to develop consensus around these issues? What are some of the limits to those models? What are some of the alternatives to those models? So all of this to say, how can we have better institutional arrangements to move forward as a country and try to chart Canada's energy future in an age of climate change?
Professor Gattinger, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. I'm sure that we'll be talking again in the future. We'll look forward to chatting about some of the research that you're doing when it gets completed.
Delighted. Thank you.